Okay, today I'm going to attempt to review a Yale Open Courses lecture series. This is Introduction to the New Testament, History and Literature by Dale Martin. Now, previously on this channel, I reviewed Introduction to the Old Testament by Christine Hayes, also part of the Yale Open University lecture series. I made a number of disclaimers at the beginning of that review. The same disclaimers are going to apply to this review, so I'll just run through them quickly, and apologies to anybody who already saw my previous video in which I said all this stuff already. I'll try and be succinct and run through this very quickly. Number one, I acknowledge that it's strange to review a lecture series. I'm doing this more for my own sake. I've got this project going where I try and review all the things I read or listen to, and I'm a little bit of a completist about it, so I like to include everything. So this is more for my own sake than, say, for the fact that I have anything intelligent about this which the world needs to hear. I'm largely just going to run through the same points that Dale Martin runs through and, give my impression here or there. But, yeah, I'm going to acknowledge right off the bat that this may be a waste of your time to listen to. What is not a waste of your time, though, is the lecture series by Dale Martin. That is absolutely fascinating. I highly recommend that. So I'll leave the link down below in the description. You don't need to necessarily listen to me, but go over and listen to Dale Martin, because that's a fascinating lecture series. Point number two, which I already made when reviewing Christine Hayes, is that you should really listen to this. And again, I'm going to repeat myself in the previous video, but there is a lack of biblical education in this country. This country, I guess, being my home country, the United States, is what I'm thinking of, although this probably applies to a lot of countries. In an ideal world, the Bible absolutely should be taught in public schools because it's such a big part of Western culture. It's not in public schools for a couple of reasons. One, there are secularists on the left who are afraid of introducing any religion into public schools. But there are also religious people maybe on the right, although maybe I shouldn't talk about religion in terms of left and right, but whatever. The religious people who want religion in the public schools but don't want it examined critically. In other words, they want the Bible in the schools as a devotional text, but not as something that you would look at from the historical critical method. So between the two of these, it means that we can't have the Bible studied in public schools, which is very unfortunate because people should study the Bible. If you grew up in a secular environment, in a secular household, there is probably a huge gap in your biblical education, and you absolutely need to understand the Bible in order to understand Western history and literature. If you grew up in a religious environment like I did, you also have a big gap because what they told you in Sunday school is very different than what historians think when they look at the Bible. And unfortunately, most people do not get this kind of education. So, highly recommend listening to this. I'm going to circle around back to this point in a minute because I have some of my own anecdotal observations from having grown up in a religious environment. And then kind of the difference between what you get taught in Sunday school and what you get taught at a university when it comes to the New Testament. Hold that thought. I want to round off the introduction just a little bit. The other thing I have to say by introduction, I was recommended this course by a friend of mine. At the time I had been reading the the unauthorized version, Truth and Fiction in the Bible by Robin Lane Fox. That's a book I'll come back to on another day when I give that one a proper book review. But I was discussing that book with a friend, and he said, oh, you would really enjoy these lecture series from Yale courses. He had been listening to Dale Martin's one, and he gave me a USB stick that had all the lectures on it. he mentioned when he gave this to me, he said, I found the content really fascinating. He said, I didn't particularly like Dale Martin's lecture style. I didn't really understand what he meant at the time, but having given it a listen, Dale Martin does have a very distinctive lecture style. It's quite different than Christine Hayes, who does the Old Testament one. Christine Hayes has a very polished and seamless presentation. She doesn't look like she's reading from notes in the sense that, you know, she's not holding the papers up in front of her, but it's very obvious that she's reading from prepared remarks in the sense that everything is very flawless. There's none of the stuttering that there is in real speech, or there's none of the pausing to find your next utterance like I'm doing right now. It's just a very flawless presentation. Dale Martin's presentation is much different. He's a little bit more going not so much off of the notes, although he's obviously prepared the content beforehand, but it's a bit more give and take with the students. It's a bit more humor injected. Occasionally he'll berate the students for not paying attention or for not giving him an answer to some of his rhetorical questions or stuff like that. It seems to be done in a very good-natured way, but apparently that rubbed my friend the wrong way, and he didn't particularly like the personality of Dale Martin. I liked it. In fact, I found it very entertaining. I thought he was a very engaging speaker. For my money, it was very entertaining and engaging. I mentioned that difference of opinion, though, I mean, I guess partly just as a caveat and partly just to throw it out here. My friend didn't like it. I really liked it. What did anybody else think about the lecture style? Okay, one more thing I'm going to say by introduction. When my friend gave it to me, it was as MP3s, which if you go to the Yale courses, their open courses website, which I will link to down below, that's how they present it. You download it as MP3s and you just kind of listen to it as audio, you know, disembodied voices. I didn't realize at the time that it's also on YouTube, but it's also on YouTube. And YouTube actually has the video of the lecture. He does a fair amount of board work where he's writing things up on the chalkboard behind him. So the video can be quite useful to watch. Of course, that's assuming you're watching it. I think a lot of people who listen to these lecture series probably do what I did, which is just put it on in the background in your apartment, and you know, maybe you're kind of washing dishes or you're cleaning something, but you're listening to it as background, where you do some sort of mindless task. I don't know. That's what I did, and that's how I assume most people are going to consume this. If you're doing that, for whatever reason, I found that the YouTube videos, the audio is not great, meaning the volume is not great. For me, it was fine when I had it on with the headphones. So, you know, if I'm sitting down at the computer surfing the net or something, I've got it on in headphones, the volume's fine. But if I'm washing dishes and I've got it on background, the YouTube version, maybe it's just my computer, I don't know, let me know. But I didn't find that the audio from the YouTube version was great. Whereas if you go to the Yale Open Courses series and just download them as MP3 files, that I found had a much better audio in terms of projecting around my apartment. So I'll link to both of them down below, both the YouTube playlist and also the Open Courses series. So you can do it either as MP3s or as a YouTube playlist. But yeah, the YouTube playlist is superior in the sense that you can actually see what he's writing on the board. The MP3s are superior in the sense that, at least on my computer, the audio was better. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. For the rest of the video, I'm just going to ramble, which means I'm going to give some of my own opinions. I'm going to talk about what I thought was interesting in the lecture series, or what I disagreed with, or whatever. We will see how much value this ends up being. feel free not to watch this. The takeaway is you should absolutely listen to the Dale Martin lectures. You don't necessarily need to listen to my thoughts on Dale Martin's lectures. That being said, just because what I do on this channel is get into my own thoughts, I'm going to give some of my own thoughts. So I already alluded to this earlier, but I think maybe giving my own background might be useful in terms of giving how I'm approaching this. I grew up in a Christian environment, went to Sunday school every week, went to, Wednesday night, youth night at my church. I also went to private Christian schools where we studied the Bible as part of the daily curriculum at these private Christian schools. And then I graduated from the private Christian schools and I went to Calvin College, which if you're not familiar with it, you can look it up on Wikipedia. I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that it's a conservative institution, although granted terms like conservative are all relative. Whenever you're talking about conservative or liberal, you're talking about in relationship to other things. So, it's more conservative than some institutions, it's less conservative than other institutions. But I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say it's on the conservative end of the spectrum. And in fact, the private schools I had gone to, the Grand Rapids Christian schools, were also part of the same Dutch Calvinist community, which was linked in with Calvin College. So this was all part of the same community. I mentioned this was all part of the same community because I found it quite surprising what they told me when I was at the college level versus what they told me in Sunday school or, when I was younger. The big things that surprised me, well, maybe I'll back up a bit and kind of present this as the lecturer presented this. So we were talking about the Gospels, and he was talking about the Synoptic Gospels. Now, if you've been to Sunday school, you're familiar with the term the Synoptics. It means the same view, and it means that Matthew, Mark, and Luke took a very similar view of Jesus' ministries, a lot of the same stories, a lot of the same events, whereas John tends to take a very different view of Jesus' ministries, a lot of different stories and different events. And a different Christology as well, although they didn't really get into that in my Sunday school education, so leaving that aside for now. So I was already familiar with the term the Synoptics, but the university professor told us something which I had never heard before in Sunday school. He said, well, not only do they have the same stories, but actually if you look at these stories in the original Greek, it's word for word the same. For much of it. The differences are something to talk about in a minute, but for much of it, it's word for word the same. So he said, this means that not only are they presenting the same view, this means that they're copying from each other. Because you cannot have word for word accounts just by coincidence. Somebody has to be copying from somebody else. He said, Mark is the shortest of the Synoptic Gospels. So scholars generally think that it's unlikely that Mark would be deleting material from Matthew or Luke. They think it much more likely that Matthew and Luke would be adding material to Mark. So for that reason, they think that Mark was the original gospel and Matthew and Luke were copying from Mark. Now, here I was, 18 years old, sitting in that college classroom, completely confused by this because, this was completely different than everything I had learned in Sunday school and the private Christian schools up until that point. And so I raised my hand and I said, but Matthew was there. And the professor said, yeah, exactly. He said, if Matthew was there, why was Matthew copying from John Mark, who wasn't even there? And then the professor said, actually, scholars don't think that Matthew actually wrote the Gospel of Matthew. The names are wrong. The Apostle Matthew didn't write the Gospel of Matthew. John Mark didn't write Mark, etc. The names on the Gospels have been assigned by later church tradition, but scholars don't actually think that the apostles actually wrote those Gospels. And that was devastating for me. The immediate reaction was just like, oh, it took away a certain amount of the shine of the Gospels, or the romanticism of the Gospels, because there's a certain romanticism associated in thinking that you're reading the eyewitness words of Jesus Christ. Sorry, thinking you're reading the eyewitness reports of some apostle who was actually there. Although I do have to admit, I've thought about this a little bit in retrospect. That romanticism, at least for me, was always more in the abstract. Because when you're actually reading the Gospel of Matthew, or at least when I was actually reading the Gospel of Matthew, you don't really get a sense when you're reading it that you're intimately tied up with the eyewitness perspective of the Apostle Matthew. There was none of this kind of like, I was born a poor but honest man and this is my story. You get the impression when you're reading the Gospel of somewhat of an omniscient, divine, almost divine narrator. It's more kind of in the abstract when you're talking about the Gospels. When you're talking about the Gospels from a removed perspective, then it was easy to kind of romanticize them as the accounts of the actual apostles. When you're actually in the middle reading them, it seems like I don't ever remember reading them and feeling intimately connected with the apostle authors, if that makes sense. But sorry, that's a digression. The professor then went on to a number of the other reasons that scholars don't think that the apostles could actually have written the Gospels. The fact that they were written in a very well-educated Greek, fact that they seem to have come from the end of the first century rather than the beginning of the first century, the fact that they seem to make some mistakes with the geography of Palestine, etc. Now, certainly from a Protestant perspective, I don't think that's particularly, that need not be particularly damaging to your faith, because the Gospels themselves never claim to be written by the apostles. So if you read the Gospel of Matthew, nowhere does it say, I, Saint Matthew, am writing this down. It was assigned by later tradition, and of course, especially I think a Protestant would not put a lot of faith in church tradition. So it doesn't necessarily conflict with the inerrancy of the Bible. It's just a problem with church tradition. But then we get to the letters of Paul. I think this was in a separate lecture, but then the professor told us that the scholars do not believe that the 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus were written by Paul. They were written by somebody else at a later time using Paul's name. Now this is potentially much more of a problem with biblical inerrancy, because now you've got somebody writing, Dear Timothy, this is from me, Paul, and it wasn't by Paul. That was a lie. The professor at the time said, don't think of this as a lie. He said this was a very common literary device in the ancient world where people who were in the same school as Paul would just use his name on the documents, and it was completely accepted and it wasn't all weird, and this was what they did all the time. I believe that's a very common argument in Christian scholarship. I have since, in the years since then, run into people who were critical of that line. For example, Bart Ehrman has a whole book on this called Forged. The name of the book is Forged. And Bart Ehrman says, no. It would be considered dishonest today it was considered dishonest then, even in the ancient world, to write something under somebody else's name. I've got more to say to this, but I'm worried about spending too much of this video not actually getting to the subject at hand, which is Dale Martin's lectures. I guess the main point in all of this is that this is what was presented to me at a conservative Christian college. And so I didn't argue back against it. If it had, if I had gone to like a liberal school or something like that, and the professors had been trying to say this, I may have been more skeptical. But because this was what was coming out from the religious department at a conservative Christian college, I thought, okay, if this is what you guys believe, I'm sure you have a very good reason to believe that. I guess my main point in mentioning this is to put maybe what Dale Martin says in a bit of context, because Dale Martin also argues that, well, he doesn't so much argue as he takes it for granted that the Gospels were not written by the apostles, and that 3, possibly 6 of Paul's of the letters of Paul in the Bible were not actually written by Paul. This is something that Dale Martin talks about in his lectures, but there are 6 letters. Was it 6 or 7? I don't remember. Let's say 6. 6 undisputed letters of Paul, which everyone agrees that Paul definitely wrote. There were 3 letters of Paul, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which everyone agrees that Paul definitely did not write. And then there are 3 that people still argue about. It was 7, wasn't it? There were 7 undisputed letters of Paul, because it was a total of 13. Sorry, I'm speaking without notes, so I'm relying completely on memory for all of this. My apologies. So, again, had I not had that background, maybe I would have been like, yeah, of course those liberals at Yale would say this. But because I had that background about hearing the same thing from a conservative Christian college, I'm more knowledgeable now that this is not just the liberal wing of scholarship. This is the consensus. This you hear it in Dale Martin's lectures, but you would hear the same thing if you would go to a conservative school as well. Yeah. So okay, so that's my background. Actually, having given that background, I was a little bit disappointed in this lecture series that Dale Martin didn't spend more time going into the relationship between the synoptic gospels. Because, as I mentioned beforehand, that was a key moment in my own introduction to the Bible course at college, and something I've continued to find fascinating ever since, is what is the relationship between the synoptic gospels, and how do scholars know this? Because if you dive into it, I think there's a lot of linguistic detective work that's being done. For example, I mentioned earlier that my professor told me that they think Matthew was copying from Mark because Mark was shorter. Now, of course, that's not a very definitive answer, but if you research this more, go to sites off the internet or stuff like that about the relationship between the synoptic gospels, there's actually a much more sophisticated reason why scholars think that Matthew is copying from Mark instead of vice versa. They talk about how Matthew and Luke tended to soften what was in Mark. When Mark presents a very abrupt, angry Jesus, that tends to get softened in Matthew and Luke. Tends to be corrections, that the wording or the grammar will get corrected in Matthew and Luke. So those are other reasons why scholars think that Matthew and Luke were copying from Mark. All of that being with the disclaimer that I'm not an expert. This is just stuff I've read on the internet. But that kind of linguistic detective work, where they can kind of look at how exactly things are worded, or look at the grammar and say, okay, this is the original, these are the copies. That interests me, and I'm a bit disappointed that that wasn't more in Dale Martin's lectures. What appears to be happening is that these lecture videos that you get on YouTube or the open course series are only the lecture parts of the course. He also refers to sections, which I guess is like a more private study group. They didn't have this system at my college, but apparently this is what they got at Yale, where you have the big lectures and then people meet for study groups with a graduate student who's leading it, or something like that. And apparently the whole relationship between the synoptic gospels comes out in the sections. So presumably all the students who were in that course got a grounding in the synoptic problem and the relationship between the synoptic gospels. It's a pity, though, it didn't come through on the video series, because all of us out here in internet land are absorbing it through the video series. So as somebody who's, I guess, critiquing or reviewing the lectures themselves, and maybe not the experience that an actual student at Yale University got, but just reviewing the lectures themselves, that seems to be an unfortunate omission. I mean, to a certain extent I can't complain, because I already had this knowledge anyways prior to viewing the course, but I would have been quite interested to hear Dale Martin's recounting of it. You know, it's always interesting to hear somebody tell you what you kind of already know, but just from another angle. And I think maybe for anybody who's completely new to New Testament scholarship, that's a rather serious omission. He goes on to talk about each of the synoptics in turn, and he refers to things like, it's obvious from his lectures that he's assuming the students know that Matthew and Luke are copying out of Mark. He also refers to Q, which I don't believe is ever explained in his lectures. Again, this must have been something that was covered in sections. Q, for anybody who doesn't know, as I said earlier, it's assumed that Matthew and Luke were copying out of Mark. But there are sayings from Jesus, which are word for word the same, which appear in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So scholars hypothesize that there was another source called Q, which Matthew and Luke both had access to, but Mark did not. Matthew and Luke apparently didn't know about the others. Matthew didn't know about Luke, and Luke didn't know about Matthew. I believe that assumption is based on the fact that wherever they couldn't go to Mark as a common source, they had wildly different accounts. So, for example, Mark doesn't say anything about the birth of Christ. Matthew has one story about the birth of Christ, and Luke has a completely different story about the birth of Christ. Mark also does not say anything about the appearances of Jesus to his disciples after the resurrection. Mark's gospel ends with the empty tomb. And then that's just the end in the original form. Matthew has one completely different story about Jesus appearing after the resurrection, and Luke has a completely different story. So I think for those reasons it's assumed that Matthew and Luke didn't know about each other, but these sayings of Jesus come from the source Q. I'm giving that all as background because it's not in Dale Martin's lecture series, so I guess somebody has to say it. Again, Dale Martin refers to Q throughout his lecture series. It's apparent that his students must know about it. Presumably they learned about it in sections, but anybody who's just watching this out of YouTube wouldn't know about it. So to the extent that these lecture series are designed by Yale University to be made public for a broader audience, in my opinion, it's a bit unfortunate that they didn't go into that nuts and bolts about the relationship of the Synoptic Gospels and Q. That being said, what he does get into is absolutely fascinating. He's got a lecture on each of the different Synoptic Gospels in which he highlights the different themes that they have, talks about their different portrayals of Jesus and the literary techniques, and it was a lot of stuff I didn't really know about. I think he talks about how, what was it, Matthew or Luke's gospel had like this long road trip about the journey to Jerusalem, which is not in the other gospels, and how their different themes are set up. A lot of very interesting stuff in there. Also, he talks about the relationship between what we know about Paul from